The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Colonel Marcus Henderson arrived at his new posting. The year was 1943, and the war was raging across multiple fronts. Henderson had been transferred to Camp Sterling, a training facility nestled in the mountains of Colorado, where the Army's most promising officers came to hone their skills before deployment overseas. Henderson was not an ordinary officer. At 35, he had already earned a reputation for his sharp, tactical mind and unwavering dedication to his soldiers. His previous assignments had taken him from the muddy trenches of basic training camps to the strategic planning rooms of high command. But nothing had prepared him for what he would witness at Camp Sterling. The facility was home to three of the Army's most distinguished generals, each a legend in his own right. General William Iron Will Morrison commanded respect through his decades of service and countless successful campaigns. His weathered face told stories of battles fought and won, and his steely gray eyes could assess a situation with lightning speed. Morrison had earned his nickname during the Great War, where his refusal to retreat in the face of overwhelming odds had saved thousands of lives. General Theodore "Thunder" Jackson was younger, but no less formidable. Known for his innovative tactics and ability to inspire troops, Jackson had revolutionized modern warfare strategies. His booming voice could be heard across any battlefield, rallying soldiers and striking fear into enemy hearts. At 42, he was considered one of the brightest military minds of his generation, with theories and methods that were studied in war colleges around the world. The third general, Charles "Silent Storm" Rodriguez, was perhaps the most enigmatic of the trio. Unlike his colleagues, Rodriguez spoke little but accomplished much. His specialty lay in covert operations and psychological warfare. Soldiers under his command moved like shadows, striking with precision and disappearing without a trace. Rodriguez had earned his reputation in conflicts that officially never happened, in places that didn't exist on any map. Henderson's arrival at Camp Sterling coincided with an unusual period of tension. The three generals, despite their mutual respect, had been engaged in an ongoing debate about training methods. Each believed his approach was superior, and their discussions had grown increasingly heated over the past months. The camp's atmosphere reflected this tension, with officers and enlisted men choosing sides and forming unofficial alliances. The source of their disagreement centered on a new training exercise designed to test decision-making under extreme pressure. Each general had developed his own version of the drill, and none was willing to compromise. Morrison favored a direct, confrontational approach that emphasized courage and determination. Jackson preferred a more strategic method that required careful planning and execution. Rodriguez advocated for a subtle psychological approach that tested mental resilience and adaptability. As Henderson settled into his quarters, he couldn't help but notice the unusual energy that permeated the camp. Soldiers moved with purpose, but there was an underlying current of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something significant to happen. The mess halls buzzed with quiet conversations, and training exercises seemed more intense than usual. During his first week, Henderson observed the three generals closely. He watched Morrison drilling troops with old-school military precision, demanding perfection in every movement and decision. The general's methods were tough but effective, producing soldiers who could follow orders without hesitation and fight with unwavering courage. Henderson noticed how Morrison's men carried themselves with a particular kind of confidence, the kind that came from knowing they could rely on their training no matter what challenges they faced. Jackson's approach was markedly different. Henderson observed him leading complex tactical exercises that resembled elaborate chess games. Soldiers under Jackson's tutelage learned to think several moves ahead, to anticipate enemy actions, and to adapt their strategies accordingly. These men displayed a different kind of confidence, one rooted in their ability to outthink and outmaneuver any opponent. Rodriguez's training sessions were perhaps the most intriguing to watch. Henderson found himself studying the general's methods with growing fascination. Rodriguez's exercises seemed deceptively simple on the surface, but Henderson quickly realized they were testing psychological limits and mental fortitude. Soldiers emerged from these sessions changed, more aware of their own capabilities and limitations, better equipped to handle the mental pressures of warfare. The tension between the three generals reached a breaking point during a staff meeting Henderson attended in his second week. The discussion began civilly enough, with each general presenting his case for why his training method should be adopted camp-wide. Morrison spoke passionately about the importance of discipline and courage, emphasizing that soldiers needed unshakable resolve to survive in combat. Jackson countered with statistics and case studies demonstrating how strategic thinking had won battles throughout history. He argued that the modern soldier needed to be more than just brave. He needed to be smart, adaptable, and capable of independent thought when communication lines were cut or commanders were lost. Rodriguez, when his turn came, spoke quietly but with undeniable authority. He reminded his colleagues that warfare had evolved beyond simple tactics and courage. The enemy was using psychological warfare, propaganda, and terror tactics that required a different kind of preparation. Soldiers needed to be mentally resilient, capable of maintaining their humanity while doing what was necessary to protect their country and comrades. The meeting grew heated as each general defended his position with increasing fervor. Henderson watched in amazement as these three titans of military strategy clashed over fundamental questions about the nature of warfare and soldier preparation. Their passion was evident, their commitment to their beliefs absolute. As the argument intensified, Henderson realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. These weren't just three officers disagreeing about training methods. They were three master practitioners of the art of war, each representing a different philosophy about how to prepare men for the ultimate test of human courage and skill. The meeting ended without resolution, the three generals agreeing only to disagree. As they filed out of the conference room, Henderson caught glimpses of something in their eyes that suggested this disagreement was far from over. The tension at Camp Sterling was about to reach its climax, and Henderson sensed that whatever was coming would test not just the soldiers under their command, but the generals themselves. That evening, as Henderson walked the camp perimeter during his rounds, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to witness something that would change his understanding of leadership, courage, and the nature of military service forever. The following morning brought an unexpected development that would change everything at Camp Sterling. Henderson was reviewing training schedules in his office when his aide knocked urgently on the door. A priority message had arrived from Washington, marked with the highest security classifications. Henderson opened the sealed envelope with growing concern. The message was brief, but its implications were staggering. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy agents had infiltrated several military training facilities across the country. Security had been compromised at multiple locations, and there was strong evidence suggesting that Camp Sterling might be the next target. The message contained specific instructions that made Henderson's blood run cold. 3 high-value enemy operatives, described only as the most dangerous infiltrators the enemy has ever deployed, were believed to be planning an assault on Camp Sterling within the next 48 hours. Their mission was to eliminate key personnel and steal classified training documents that could compromise future military operations. What made the situation even more critical was the intelligence assessment that followed. According to intercepted communications, the enemy operatives had been specifically briefed about the 3 generals at Camp Sterling. They knew about Morrison's direct approach, Jackson's strategic methods, and Rodriguez's psychological techniques. The enemy had studied these men, learned their patterns, and developed a plan specifically designed to exploit their individual strengths and weaknesses. Henderson immediately called for an emergency meeting with the 3 generals. As they gathered, in the secure briefing room, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Henderson read the intelligence report aloud, watching as the faces of the 3 legendary officers grew increasingly grave. Morrison was the first to respond, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. He suggested implementing immediate defensive measures, positioning guards at all entrances and conducting regular patrols of the facility perimeter. His instinct was to meet the threat head-on, to create an impenetrable fortress that would deter any attack. Jackson, however, had different ideas. He proposed a more sophisticated approach suggesting they use the advance warning to their advantage by setting up elaborate traps and diversions. He wanted to turn the entire camp into a strategic maze that would confuse and divide the enemy operatives, allowing the defenders to pick them off one by one. Rodriguez listened to both suggestions before offering his own perspective. He believed the best defense would be psychological, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and paranoia that would make the enemy operatives doubt their intelligence and second-guess their plans. He proposed spreading false information, creating decoys, and using misdirection to make the enemy attack the wrong targets at the wrong times. As the debate continued, Henderson realized that the three generals were falling into the same pattern that had been dividing them for months. Each was so convinced of the superiority of his own approach that he couldn't see the value in the other's suggestions. The enemy operatives, if they were indeed coming, would face a divided defense, which might be exactly what they were counting on. The intelligence report had mentioned something else that Henderson found particularly troubling. The enemy operatives weren't just any infiltrators. They were specialists trained to exploit exactly the kind of division that existed at Camp Sterling. They had studied not just military tactics, but psychology and human behavior. They understood how pride and ego could blind even the most capable leaders to obvious solutions. Over the next several hours, as the generals worked on their individual defense plans, Henderson began to piece together a disturbing picture. The enemy's plan wasn't just to attack the camp, it was to use the generals' own strengths against them. They would expect Morrison to create strong defensive positions, Jackson to set up strategic ambushes, and Rodriguez to employ psychological tactics. By knowing what to expect, they could prepare countermeasures for each approach. Henderson spent the afternoon observing the preparations around the camp. Morrison's men were building barriers and establishing checkpoints with military precision. Every entrance was fortified, every potential weak point reinforced. The general himself moved among his soldiers, checking their positions and ensuring they understood their orders. His confidence was infectious, and Henderson could see why Morrison's direct approach had been so successful in previous campaigns. Meanwhile, Jackson had transformed sections of the camp into an elaborate tactical puzzle. His soldiers were positioned in carefully planned formations, ready to execute complex maneuvers at a moment's notice. Communication lines had been established, backup plans prepared, and contingencies mapped out for every possible scenario. Henderson watched with admiration as Jackson coordinated these preparations with the skill of a master chess player. Rodriguez's preparations were less visible but no less thorough. His men moved quietly through the shadows, setting up observation points and establishing communication networks that would allow them to monitor every corner of the facility. False information was being planted in locations where enemy operatives might find it, and decoy operations were being staged to create confusion about the camp's true defensive capabilities. As evening approached, Henderson felt a growing sense of unease. The three generals had created three separate defensive systems, but they weren't working together. Each general's plan was excellent on its own, but the lack of coordination between them created gaps that a skilled enemy could exploit. Henderson attempted to address this issue during an evening briefing, but the three generals remained convinced that their individual approaches were sufficient. Morrison argued that a strong defense didn't need complexity. Jackson insisted that strategic thinking was more important than brute force, and Rodriguez maintained that psychological warfare would render the other approaches unnecessary. The night passed slowly with heightened security throughout the camp. Soldiers remained at their posts, alert for any sign of the predicted attack. Henderson found himself unable to sleep, walking the camp perimeter and checking on the various defensive positions. He could see Morrison's guards maintaining their vigilant watch, Jackson's tactical teams running through their coordination drills, and Rodriguez's shadow operators disappearing and reappearing like ghosts. As dawn approached without incident, some of the tension began to ease. Several soldiers suggested that perhaps the intelligence report had been wrong, or that the enemy operatives had been deterred by the obvious preparations. But Henderson's instincts told him otherwise. Professional infiltrators wouldn't be discouraged by visible defenses. They would simply adapt their approach. His concerns proved justified when the first reports came in during the morning shift. Change. 3 individuals had been spotted near the camp perimeter during the night, conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance. They had avoided the obvious guard positions and patrol routes, suggesting they possessed detailed knowledge of the facility's layout and defensive measures. More troubling was the realization that these individuals had managed to observe all 3 generals' defensive preparations without being detected. They had seen Morrison's fortifications, studied Jackson's tactical positions, and identified Rodriguez's hidden observation posts. The enemy now knew exactly what they were facing, and Henderson feared they were already adapting their plan accordingly. The second day of the crisis was about to begin, and Henderson sensed that the real test was still to come. The second day brought an escalation that none of them had anticipated. Henderson was reviewing overnight patrol reports when Lieutenant Barnes rushed into his office with news that made his stomach drop. During the night, someone had managed to breach the camp's outer perimeter and leave behind a calling card that chilled everyone who saw it. On the main bulletin board outside the mess hall, a simple message had been pinned with military precision. Written in perfect English on standard military stationery, it read, "We know your methods. We know your weaknesses. We know exactly how each of you thinks. Tomorrow at noon, one of your 3 generals will fall. Choose wisely which one you can afford to lose." The psychological impact of the message was immediate and devastating. Word spread through the camp like wildfire, and Henderson could see the effect it was having on morale. Soldiers who had been confident in their preparations now looked uncertain and afraid. The enemy had managed to penetrate their defenses without being detected, and worse yet, they were playing psychological games that struck at the heart of military command structure. Henderson immediately called another emergency meeting with the 3 generals. As they gathered in the briefing room, the tension was palpable. Each general's face showed a mixture of anger, determination, and something Henderson had never seen in them before: doubt. Morrison's reaction was characteristically direct. He wanted to increase patrols, add more guards, and create even stronger defensive positions. His voice carried the authority of decades of command, but Henderson could detect an underlying strain. The general was grappling with the realization that his straightforward approach might not be enough against an enemy that seemed to know his every move. Jackson approached the problem strategically as expected. He began analyzing the message for clues, studying the timing of its placement and trying to deduce the enemy's plan from their actions. His tactical mind was working overtime, considering multiple scenarios and calculating probabilities. But Henderson noticed that Jackson's usual confidence had been shaken by the enemy's apparent ability to predict and counter his strategic thinking. Rodriguez's response was the most troubling of all. The master of psychological warfare seemed genuinely impressed by the enemy's tactics. He acknowledged that the message was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation designed not just to create fear, but to drive a wedge between the 3 generals and their soldiers. The enemy had managed to turn the generals' greatest strength, their individual expertise, into a potential liability. As the morning progressed, Henderson observed disturbing changes in the camp's atmosphere. Soldiers began questioning which general they should follow, wondering if their chosen leader might be the one targeted for elimination. Some began switching between different defensive positions, unsure where they would be safest. Others started forming small groups, discussing in hushed tones which general was most likely to survive the predicted attack. The enemy's psychological warfare was working exactly as intended. By threatening to eliminate one of the 3 generals, they had created chaos without firing a single shot. The unity of command that was essential to military effectiveness was crumbling under the weight of uncertainty and fear. Henderson realized that the real battle had already begun, and it wasn't being fought with weapons or tactics. It was being fought in the minds and hearts of everyone at Camp Sterling. The enemy operatives understood that destroying morale was often more effective than destroying equipment or eliminating personnel. Around midday, the situation took another disturbing turn. A second message appeared, this time delivered in a way that demonstrated even more sophisticated infiltration capabilities. The note was found inside General Morrison's private office, placed precisely in the center of his desk where he would be sure to see it. This message was more specific and more chilling. General Morrison, your direct approach makes you predictable. Your soldiers know where you will be and when you will be there. So do we. You have 6 hours to consider whether your courage is worth the lives of your men. Within an hour, similar messages had been discovered in Jackson's strategic planning room and Rodriguez's secure communications center. Each message was tailored to the specific general, demonstrating intimate knowledge of their methods, personalities, and psychological profiles. Jackson's message read, "Your strategies are impressive, but we have studied them all. We know your contingencies, your backup plans, and your escape routes. Your tactical brilliance will become your downfall when we turn your own plans against you." Rodriguez's message was perhaps the most unsettling. "You understand the power of the mind, but so do we. We have been inside your head for months, learning your techniques, studying your methods. Today you will discover what it feels like to be on the receiving end of psychological warfare." The effect on the three generals was immediate and dramatic. Each man had built his reputation on the belief that his approach was superior, that his methods were unbeatable. Now they were facing an enemy that not only understood their techniques, but claimed to be able to use them against them. Henderson watched with growing concern as the three generals began to withdraw into themselves. Morrison started second-guessing his defensive positions, wondering if his predictable patterns were indeed making him vulnerable. Jackson became obsessed with trying to outthink an enemy that seemed to anticipate his every strategic move. Rodriguez found himself caught in a psychological maze of his own making, uncertain whether his thoughts and plans were truly his own, or had been somehow manipulated by the enemy. The afternoon brought additional challenges that tested everyone's resolve. Equipment began malfunctioning in subtle but significant ways. Communication lines experienced mysterious interference. Supply deliveries were delayed or misdirected. Each incident could have been explained as normal operational difficulties, but the cumulative effect created an atmosphere of paranoia and doubt. Henderson began to suspect that the enemy operatives had been active at Camp Sterling for much longer than anyone had realized. The level of detailed knowledge they possessed, their ability to infiltrate secure areas undetected, and their understanding of each general's psychological profile suggested months of careful preparation and observation. As the day progressed, Henderson found himself in an impossible position. He could see that the three generals were being systematically undermined, their confidence eroded, their effectiveness compromised. But he was powerless to stop it because he couldn't identify the source of the psychological assault. The enemy had chosen their battlefield carefully. They weren't attacking with conventional weapons or tactics that could be defended against with traditional military methods. Instead, they were attacking the very foundation of military effectiveness: trust, confidence, and unity of command. By evening, the atmosphere at Camp Sterling had become almost unbearable. Soldiers moved nervously through their duties, constantly, looking over their shoulders, jumping at unexpected sounds. The three generals continued their preparations, but their movements lacked the decisive confidence that had made them legendary leaders. Henderson realized that unless something changed dramatically, the enemy wouldn't need to eliminate any of the generals physically. They were already succeeding in destroying their effectiveness as military leaders. The psychological warfare was achieving everything a direct assault could accomplish without any of the risks. As night fell on the second day of the crisis, Henderson knew that tomorrow would bring the final confrontation. The enemy had promised that one of the three generals would fall at noon, and Henderson feared that all three might be destroyed by the psychological pressure they were under. The real question was no longer whether the enemy would succeed in their mission, but whether anyone at Camp Sterling would be left with the mental strength and clarity to stop them. The third morning dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over Camp Sterling. Henderson had barely slept, spending most of the night walking the grounds and observing the deteriorating situation. The psychological Pressure was taking its toll on everyone, from the lowest-ranking enlisted men to the three legendary generals themselves. At 0600 hours, Henderson received an urgent summons to General Morrison's office. When he arrived, he found all three generals already assembled, their faces grim with determination and exhaustion. The night had clearly been as sleepless for them as it had been for him. Morrison spoke first, his voice carrying less of its usual commanding authority. He had spent the night reviewing every aspect of his defensive preparations, and had come to a troubling conclusion. The enemy's knowledge of his methods was so complete that they could potentially predict and counter every move he might make. His straightforward, direct approach, which had served him so well throughout his career, had become a liability against an enemy that understood him so thoroughly. Jackson's analysis was equally disturbing. He had run dozens of strategic scenarios throughout the night, trying to find a tactical solution that the enemy couldn't anticipate. Every plan he developed seemed to have obvious flaws that a well-informed opponent could exploit. His strategic thinking, usually his greatest asset, felt like a trap that was closing around him with each passing hour. Rodriguez's assessment was perhaps the most unsettling of all. As an expert in psychological warfare, he recognized the sophisticated nature of the assault they were facing. The enemy wasn't just using standard intimidation tactics, they were employing advanced psychological manipulation techniques that suggested professional training and extensive preparation. They had studied not just military doctrine, but human psychology and behavioral science. As the three generals shared their concerns, Henderson began to see something that hadn't been apparent before. Each man was so focused on the ways his individual approach had been compromised that he wasn't considering how their combined strengths might create new possibilities. The psychological warfare was working precisely because it was keeping them isolated in their own spheres of expertise. At 800 hours, a new development changed the entire dynamic of the crisis. A message arrived through official military channels, bearing the seal of Army intelligence. Henderson opened it with trembling hands, expecting another piece of bad news. Instead, he found information that cast everything in a different light. The message revealed that the three enemy operatives were not just any infiltrators. They were specialists who had been specifically trained to counter the exact methods employed by Morrison, Jackson, and Rodriguez. Intelligence had discovered that the enemy had been studying these three generals for over a year, analyzing their past campaigns, their training methods, and their psychological profiles. More importantly, the intelligence report revealed the enemy's ultimate objective. They weren't planning to eliminate the generals physically. Instead, their mission was to destroy the reputation and effectiveness of three of America's most successful military leaders. By demonstrating that they could predict and counter the methods of Morrison, Jackson, and Rodriguez, they hoped to undermine confidence in American military training and leadership. The revelation was both terrifying and illuminating. Henderson realized that the enemy's greatest weapon wasn't their knowledge of each general's individual methods. It was their ability to keep the three men thinking and acting independently. As long as Morrison, Jackson, and Rodriguez remained focused on their separate approaches, they were playing directly into the enemy's hands. Henderson called for an immediate strategy session, but this time he took a different approach. Instead of allowing each general to present his individual plan, he asked them to consider what would happen if they combined their methods into a single, unified defense. The suggestion was met with initial resistance, as each man had spent decades perfecting his individual approach and was reluctant to compromise his methods. However, as they began to discuss the possibilities, something remarkable happened. Morrison's direct approach could provide the foundation for a strong defensive perimeter. Jackson's strategic thinking could be used to coordinate complex tactical maneuvers within that perimeter. Rodriguez's psychological warfare expertise could be employed to confuse and misdirect the enemy, while the other elements moved into position. For the first time since the crisis began, Henderson saw genuine enthusiasm return to the three generals' faces. They began building on each other's ideas, creating synergies that none of them could have achieved alone. Morrison's defensive positions became more effective when guided by Jackson's strategic coordination. Jackson's tactical plans became more powerful when supported by Morrison's disciplined execution, and Rodriguez's psychological misdirection. The transformation in the camp's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who had been confused and demoralized by the conflicting approaches suddenly found themselves part of a unified defense that made sense. Instead of choosing between three different methods, they could see how each element contributed to a comprehensive strategy that was stronger than the sum of its parts. By mid-morning, the defensive preparations had been completely reorganized. Morrison's soldiers maintained their strong perimeter positions, but now they were coordinated through Jackson's communication networks and supported by Rodriguez's intelligence-gathering operations. Jackson's tactical teams were positioned to execute complex maneuvers, but they were anchored by Morrison's reliable defensive positions and guided by Rodriguez's psychological assessments of enemy behavior. Rodriguez's psychological warfare operations were expanded beyond simple misdirection to include active intelligence gathering and enemy manipulation, but they were protected by Morrison's defensive strength and enhanced by Jackson's strategic coordination. As the clock approached 1100 hours, Henderson could feel the change in the camp's energy. The atmosphere of fear and uncertainty had been replaced by focused determination. The soldiers moved with renewed confidence, understanding their roles in the larger defensive strategy. The three generals worked together with a seamless coordination that made their previous conflicts seem impossible. At 11:30 hours, the first confirmed sighting of the enemy operatives was reported. 3 individuals had been spotted moving through the forest that surrounded Camp Sterling, approaching from different directions in what appeared to be a coordinated assault. Their movement patterns suggested they were indeed the specialists who had been trained to counter each general's individual methods. Henderson watched with growing anticipation as the unified defense prepared to face its ultimate test. The enemy operatives were approaching the camp expecting to face 3 separate predictable defensive systems that they had been trained to defeat. Instead, they were about to encounter something completely unexpected, a unified force that combined the best elements of all 3 approaches into something entirely new. The psychological warfare that had been used against the camp was about to be turned back on its originators. The enemy had studied Morrison, Jackson, and Rodriguez as individual commanders, but they had no experience with the defensive system that emerged when these 3 legendary leaders worked together. As the Isiatim clock moved toward noon, Henderson positioned himself at the central command post where he could observe the entire engagement. The 3 generals stood together, their previous conflicts forgotten in the face of the challenge they now faced as a unified team. For the first time since the crisis began, Henderson felt confident that Camp Sterling would not just survive the attack, but would demonstrate the true strength that came from combining individual excellence with collective cooperation. At exactly 11:45 hours, the carefully orchestrated defense of Camp Sterling faced its ultimate test. Henderson watched from the command post as 3 enemy operatives emerged from the forest at precisely calculated intervals, each approaching from a different direction. Their movements were professional, coordinated, and confident. They clearly believed they understood exactly what they were facing. The first operative approached Morrison's sector from the northeast. This infiltrator moved with the calculated precision of someone who had studied every aspect of the general's defensive methods. He avoided the obvious guard positions, skirted the established patrol routes, and headed directly for what should have been a weak point in Morrison's traditional defensive perimeter. What the operative didn't expect was Rodriguez's psychological misdirection working in perfect harmony with Morrison's defensive strength. The apparent weak point was actually a carefully constructed trap, with hidden observation posts feeding real-time intelligence to Jackson's tactical coordination center. Instead of finding an easy breach in the defense, the operative walked directly into a situation where every move was being monitored and reported. The second operative approached Jackson's tactical sector from the southwest. This infiltrator demonstrated an impressive understanding of strategic thinking, using complex movement patterns designed to confuse and misdirect the defending forces. He employed classic tactical deception techniques, creating false trails and using natural cover in ways that should have overwhelmed traditional strategic defenses. However, this operative had not anticipated the combination of Jackson's strategic coordination with Rodriguez's psychological warfare capabilities. While Jackson's teams tracked the infiltrators' tactical movements, Rodriguez's operatives were feeding him false information through carefully placed intelligence that made the enemy believe his deception techniques were working. The infiltrator thought he was successfully confusing the defenders, when in reality, every aspect of his approach was being monitored and analyzed. The third operative took the most direct route, approaching Rodriguez's sector from the west. This infiltrator was clearly the psychological warfare specialist, using techniques designed to create confusion and panic among the defending forces. He employed sound manipulation, visual misdirection, and other psychological tactics that should have been effective against traditional military defenses. The psychological warfare specialist encountered something completely unexpected, his own techniques being used against him with surgical precision, while being supported by the disciplined strength of Morrison's defensive positions and the strategic coordination of Jackson's tactical systems. Rodriguez had anticipated every psychological manipulation the enemy might employ, and had prepared countermeasures that turned the specialist's own methods against him. At exactly noon, as the enemy had predicted, the three operatives launched their coordinated assault on what they believed were three separate, predictable defensive systems. What they encountered instead was something none of their training had prepared them for: a unified defense that combined the strengths of all three approaches while eliminating the weaknesses that each approach possessed individually. The first operative, expecting to face Morrison's direct but predictable defensive methods, found himself caught in a web of psychological misdirection and strategic complexity that completely disoriented him. Morrison's soldiers maintained their disciplined positions, but they were guided by intelligence from Rodriguez's network and coordinated through Jackson's tactical communications. The operative's knowledge of Morrison's individual methods was useless against this hybrid approach. The second operative, prepared to outwit Jackson's strategic thinking through superior tactical deception, discovered that his movements were being anticipated not just by strategic analysis, but by psychological profiling and direct observational intelligence. Jackson's tactical coordination was enhanced by Morrison's disciplined execution and Rodriguez's behavioral analysis. The complex strategic thinking the operative had been trained to counter was now supported by elements he had never encountered in combination. The third operative, confident in his ability to create psychological chaos among the defenders, found his techniques being neutralized by a unified command structure that combined psychological resilience with tactical flexibility and strategic depth. Rodriguez's psychological countermeasures were anchored by Morrison's unshakable discipline and enhanced by Jackson's adaptive strategic thinking. Henderson watched in amazement as the three enemy operatives, each highly trained and supremely confident, were systematically neutralized by the combined defensive system. None of them had been physically harmed, but all three had been rendered completely ineffective by encountering something their training had never prepared them for. The first operative was captured when he walked directly into what he thought was a weak point in the defensive perimeter, only to discover it was a carefully constructed trap that used his own knowledge of Morrison's methods against him. His confidence in his intelligence about the general's defensive patterns led him to make assumptions that proved completely wrong when those patterns were enhanced by elements from the other two generals' approaches. The second operative was apprehended when his complex tactical movements, designed to confuse traditional strategic defenses, instead provided Jackson's enhanced coordination system with perfect intelligence about his capabilities and intentions. His sophisticated deception techniques worked exactly as planned, except that the defenders were prepared for them and had developed countermeasures that turned his tactical sophistication into a liability. The third operative surrendered when he realized that his psychological warfare techniques were not only being neutralized, but were being used to provide the defenders with detailed information about his methods and objectives. His expertise in psychological manipulation became a weakness when faced with Rodriguez's countermeasures supported by the disciplined strength of Morrison's forces and the strategic coordination of Jackson's systems. As the immediate threat was neutralized, Henderson observed something remarkable happening among the soldiers at Camp Sterling. The successful defense had demonstrated something that would change their understanding of military effectiveness forever. They had witnessed three individual approaches, each excellent on its own, combine into something far more powerful than any single method could have achieved. The three generals stood together at the command post, watching as their combined defensive system completed its work with flawless efficiency. Morrison's direct approach had provided the foundation of disciplined strength that made everything else possible. Jackson's strategic thinking had created the coordination and flexibility that allowed the defense to adapt to unexpected challenges. Rodriguez's psychological warfare expertise had provided the intelligence and misdirection that turned the enemy's knowledge against them. But more importantly, they had discovered that their individual strengths were amplified exponentially when combined with the strengths of their colleagues. Morrison's directness became more effective when guided by strategic thinking and enhanced by psychological insight. Jackson's strategic approach became more powerful when supported by disciplined execution and psychological analysis. Rodriguez's psychological warfare became more effective when anchored by reliable defensive strength and strategic coordination. The enemy's plan had backfired completely. Instead of demonstrating the weaknesses of American military leadership, they had accidentally created the conditions that forced three legendary commanders to discover the true potential of unified leadership. The psychological warfare designed to divide them had instead revealed the extraordinary power that emerged when their individual excellences were combined into a single, coordinated effort. As the afternoon progressed and the crisis officially ended, Henderson realized he had witnessed something that would influence military thinking for generations to come. The three generals had not just defended Camp Sterling, they had pioneered a new approach to military leadership that combined individual expertise with collective strength in ways that created entirely new possibilities for military effectiveness. The aftermath of the successful defense of Camp Sterling revealed truths that no one could have anticipated when the crisis began. Henderson spent the following days interviewing the captured enemy operatives, and their testimonies provided insights that changed his understanding of warfare, leadership, and human nature. The three operatives, when questioned individually, expressed genuine bewilderment at what they had encountered. Each had been